Welcome and thanks for joining us for part two of our discussion with Nick Weber. He's the acting director of the Office of Scientific Computing Services for the Center for Information Technology at the NIH. And Nick, I want to get to the question of kind of how culturally people that use the cloud computing facility at NIH refer to it, how it's changed how people think about computing. You know, in the old days, people would walk around with punch cards, and that kind of had a cultural meaning to it. Computers had names. You know, just like in my field, you would have the name for the camera that took a picture to make a plate. It was called the Lucy. I'm going down to the Lucy room, this kind of strange stuff. Has cloud kind of come into the lexicon and become a cultural thing for NIH?
It has started to, yes, it has started to. So I definitely can identify with the named computers. All of our high-performance computing environments at NIH have names. Griffin and one called locus, which is a part of a gene, is the locus on a gene. So
sure, yeah.
That makes sense. But yeah, for the cloud, I think as people have been using it more in their personal lives, as the pandemic has driven us more toward having to use these tools, people kind of get an understanding of, oh, my data and my files are stored in the cloud, so I can access it from my computer from home, I can access it from my computer at work. Different locations, I can get it from my phone to get access to those. Similarly, personally, you have iCloud and you have Gmail, perhaps cloud-based email that people are using. So it's become more part of the vernacular. But specifically for research computing, Strides has actually, fortunately, kind of gotten a bit of a recognition to just be known as a program. It's not cloud at NIH. We're going to use Strides. We're going to go through this process. And that's helped as well to kind of say, oh, what is that? Somebody asking their counterpart if they haven't heard of it, and then people describing, okay, it's a way to get access to essentially somebody else's computational data center and resources and services. I think people have started to pick up on what that means, even if they didn't necessarily know how computing happened before. I think they have an understanding of, okay, it's happening in the cloud somewhere out there. But I know I can get access to things, and I can access them from anywhere, pretty much at any time, and that's helped people. Kind of think about, it's work is not where you go; it's what you do, so they don't feel like they have to be sitting at their work desk or in the laboratory to be able to work on the important work that they're doing.
Yeah, you might say at one time you had to go to the computer and feed it.
Correct.
Now the computer comes to you and feeds you wherever you are.
Yes. Sometimes too much, right? Sometimes it is attached too much to you.
Right, yeah, sometimes you want to turn it off, but it's always on there if you need it. And I want to talk about the workflows, process, because each phase of computing has affected how people work.
Yep.
And that's true of scientists and researchers and health professionals. And so what have you seen as a successful way to modernize workflows and processes by virtue of having this great cloud facility, multi-cloud facility?
Yeah, so typically, and it's hard to say typically in research because there's a lot of edge cases. What we do find is that there are large instruments, for example, that are generating a lot of data. Maybe that's a microscope, maybe that's a sequencing instrument. Lots of different things that researchers use to generate data for their experiments. Typically, what we'll do, those instruments are local because you have to feed it samples or whatever you might be doing with it. And there will be some initial processing on the local network for that instrument to bring the data together, maybe put it on our high-performance computing environment to do some initial processing and make sure that you have these sets that you can then move to the cloud and do additional processing or sharing on, additional collaboration on. So that's a pattern that we're starting to see really emerge of instrument in the lab connected to some sort of local storage, doing some initial computation, maybe some of the stuff that you want to experiment on, right? The stuff we talked about earlier, where you don't want to do a bunch of it in the cloud if you're not sure exactly what you're going to do with it, because it's going to cost more money than an investment we've already made in our local supercomputer. So you do some of that there, and then you can move it to the cloud to establish, again, those sharing capabilities or additional analytics with AI and ML that are available in the cloud environments.
And could also this local processing maybe normalize data sets from, say, more than one machine generating the data, because you might need to have them combined in some way for a scientific purpose or a research purpose. But again, the local computing would then normalize it, combine it, whatever, and then when it goes to the cloud as a unit, then it's available to the researchers.
That's one of the biggest challenges, I would say, in research is bringing different data sets together that were generated at different times or by different people.
Or by different formats and different technologies.
For sure. And it's incredibly important to have ways to harmonize those data, to use consistent language, consistent metadata, or what we call ontologies for describing the particular how you processed it, or what exactly the unit of measure was, or if there's M and F for male and female in one data set, and another's male and female, and one's 1 and 0, however they coded it.
Sure.
You have to kind of bring that all together.
An old problem.
To make sense, of course, of data. And as we're moving to the cloud, I think we're seeing that actually maybe be exacerbated because people are able to share much more broadly than they might have been in years past with maybe a few different labs that they're collaborating with. There are huge consortia of kind of research networks that now need to bring data together to do something at scale, to ask questions we couldn't ask before and answer before because we didn't have enough of a power of the experiment, sampling power of the experiment that we could get with all of these data sets being brought together. So that's an incredibly important point, and it's an important role for NIH to establish some of the standards and some of the ways that those that we fund share their data, make it available. And actually, you're probably aware that NIH earlier this year came out with a new data management and sharing policy whereby all research grants, not just certain types that we specified in the past, but all research grants have to have a data management and sharing plan as part of their grant application. And they have to make their data available following that plan to share with the broad community so that the investment in research is extended and so that we can do reproducibility of experiments and make sure that the science was good. And if we learned some things later on, we could go back to old data sets and reanalyze those. So this critical need of bringing data together, it seems like a straightforward problem, but it's extremely difficult because it's a people problem, it's a community problem. How do we bring all of it together and do it the same way? People have different ways of analyzing and processing that don't necessarily want to change to somebody else's way.
And also the data management and sharing policy is a way to have accountability for how research is done.
Absolutely, yeah. So we want to make sure that what we're investing in has some sort of expected outcome, right? And that's the accountability side. We invested in this grant, we invested in this research. Here's data that are made available for people to be able to, again, analyze and reuse. Our director for data science, you may have talked to her before, her name is Dr. Susan Gregorek. She has often said that data is like the new oil. So data is kind of an asset, and it's something that we need to kind of build capabilities around. So we're extracting it, we're processing it, we're transporting it, we're putting it into products. So petroleum goes into gasoline and kerosene and all of these other things, but they also go into clothes and electronics and contact lenses and everything else. So trying to have data be the central component of what the outcome of research that can again be used, reused, traded as a commodity. It's a different way of looking at things than I think we've done in the past, where it was really the manuscript. What's the finding? You publish or perish, right? Now I think data is becoming more of a first-class citizen of the research endeavor and having a life of its own that people can extend and reuse.
Right, and I wanted to go back to the question on that note that you mentioned of the zeros are male and ones are female in one system and just the opposite in the other. That's actually an important question in medicine because, especially in the health domain and medicine domain, because the factors that people are researching for disparity in outcomes, for the environmental effects or the societal, institutional background, locational effects of health outcomes is a big area of scientific research in health. And so there's many, many more factors than male-female now that go into research. So that question, it seems like a small detail, but it's actually a really important point. that it's getting more complicated, and therefore you really have to have consistency across maybe dozens of factors to which you apply a research subject. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, and I would take it further with some of our research programs. It's intended to look at more and more factors. So, for example, we have something called the All of Us research program. It's really meant to bring on a million participants within the United States to reflect the diversity of our country and not say there's a one-size-fits-all treatment for somebody. We're looking at more precise treatments or diagnostics for that individual based on their biology, their genetic makeup, and their family health history, their environment. We have all the smoke in the air these days, right, from the Canadian wildfires, but also their lifestyle. And so you can join, anyone can join this, I have, and you can upload your Fitbit data, and you can have other things that allow lots of researchers to look at lots of data, and the point of male, female, the point of these different data elements that are coming from all these different people across the country, all these different ways of capturing data in medical centers and various locations makes that problem even more important, but it also reflects the importance of those individual variables and coming up with a targeted outcome to help Tom, right, instead of help the generic population for what may be an affliction that you may be dealing with.
Right. In fact, I asked Dr. Collins when he was running NIH. I said, "I'll join the million." He said, "Well, actually, we're pretty tapped out on white male baby boomers, so they got enough of those. But they need the more diverse
population
people to make it really work for everybody." Interesting. And let's talk about security for a moment, because again, in the medical context, there are extra requirements of HIPAA and privacy and all of these things that really do complicate data sharing, data processing for removal of those identifying factors, this kind of thing. Maybe discuss how that works and how cloud enables that.
Sure. Yeah. So absolutely. NIH works and runs many clinical trials and clinical studies where there are human participants in these trials that we need to protect the privacy of the data that is gathered and the privacy of the individual, and we have to kind of honor how they have agreed to have that data be used, and that's incredibly important to the research process. But it does introduce some additional challenges in having what we refer to as controlled access data as opposed to public access data, to make sure that there are proper protocols in place for who can get access, for what purposes, for how long, those sorts of things. So it introduces the need to establish more standardized ways of requesting and processing those applications for the data sets. But there are also tools, as you mentioned, on the cloud that can help to de-identify data sets. So maybe it's looking at imaging data that may have come off of a radiology machine that's stamped on the person's name and the date and any other identifying information. There are algorithms and other things that are established and being built or collaborated on that make their way into the cloud platforms and services to automatically remove that identifying information and make those data sets more broadly available for research. So it's absolutely especially going back to All of Us research program where there are 1 million people who are contributing data. You have to have some sort of mechanism to say, how can my data be available to me? I want to see it. I want to know what's going on. Maybe available to researchers, but maybe not available to people to necessarily do something to commercialize, right? So those are important factors of how NIH treats any clinical study, but it does introduce new ways of thinking about how to share and who you can share with. That we need additional tools and capabilities.
And that de-identification process, can that happen as a cloud service or do you do it locally?
Either one. There are cloud services that have been established as part of a data processing workflow to go through and automatically remove those identifiers. And not just for imaging data, there's the capability for genomic data, DNA data, to kind of reconstruct or do something that you're bringing all this data together, and you can maybe get some identifying information as you bring multiple data sets together. So there's a lot of interesting ways to code it to make sure it's properly protected, encrypted, and only shared with other people. And definitely the cloud providers are becoming more and more advanced on having security capabilities and compliance against those capabilities to say, this is protected. It's not going to get into the wrong hands.
And we should point out that de-identification technology is also a moving target because the bad guys find really subtle ways of getting to an identity from what you thought was completely anonymous information.
Correct.
A detail there. And any projects that you found, well, maybe this isn't ideal for the cloud?
Yeah, so there definitely are projects that require a lot of heavy-duty, specialized machinery that if we've already made that investment and we have it on our supercomputer, it doesn't make sense from a cost perspective to go rent it when you already own it, right? So those are the standard examples of use the resources that you have rather than kind of going and paying by the drink for an analysis on the cloud. There are other things that again, depending on sensitivity of the data, whether you have a lot of other connected systems on premise that that system needs to talk to and pull data from to integrate, those may dictate whether you want to have a given application running in the cloud versus also running on-prem, because you'd have to move the rest of the component infrastructure and resources with it.
Just a quick interjection there. Would that say possibly apply, for example, to mental health information or substance abuse information? All of that is evaluated within NIH somewhere.
It is.
And those are probably more sensitive to people than, something that whether they have some boil on their skin or something. That type of data would be where you might say maybe not in the cloud.
Yeah, so I think I've seen a changing tide on this because in the past that would absolutely be the case. It's too sensitive. We need to keep it close hold. And if it's in the cloud, it's outside of our immediate kind of control. But the security controls and the kind of capabilities that cloud companies can bring to bear with economies of scale that we can never do internally, are kind of changing that a little bit and saying, well, maybe things are more secure in the cloud than what we would have on-prem because we're never going to have the resources and the people like an Amazon will to fight off all the bad guys from all the different kind of domains and disciplines they support. Banking and Netflix and all of these other things that are services that we use every day. So I hear your point, but it is changing a little bit to say we can have sensitive data in the cloud if we do it carefully.
Got it. And we've just got a couple of minutes left. Tell us what you're thinking about in the future and the process by which you think about the future. How do you know what you want to do next, and how do you set the groundwork for the next generation of cloud adoption?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think you can wave your hands and you can say artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and OpenAI and all of these things. I think we're still a little far away from really good practical examples of how we're doing that in research. I think things will come, but it's in the peak of the hype cycle right now. So I would say rather what I see as the future of cloud is more and more research programs and data sets being moved to the cloud, and people kind of exposing, here's my data set, here's kind of a way to access that in consistent ways that would be very different if it was everyone's individual flavor of how they set it up at their institution. If we can establish common patterns and ways to store, manage, share data in the cloud, that's where we get that sample power. That's where we get huge collaborations. That's where we get serendipitous findings by putting data sets together that we wouldn't have thought of before. And so I think as more and more research institutions and researchers are seeing these capabilities and being drawn to the cloud for the services that are there, maybe the ease of getting started, I think what we're going to find is these kind of data federations, data that are not necessarily were never together before, that are coming together, that will really help to drive new research findings, but also new research questions that we never even thought to ask before, because those data weren't available. And the data sharing and management policy that NIH has put out is going to drive that even further. And that gets back to the data as the new oil. That's the asset that we're funding, and we want to make sure is widely available. And the more people who can access it from underprivileged research institutions as well, in addition to those that have lots of resources, I think the better the outcomes are going to be for all of us. And that's really where I think the power is going to be, is bringing more people to the research problem, bringing citizen scientists who are looking at their own data from the All of Us research program and getting interested and invested and saying this is cool, and kids kind of coming in and saying, wow, I want to get involved in that. I want to be the next generation of researchers who are doing this stuff. I think is really where I hope things go, maybe a little pie in the sky.
Well, let's hope not. I think it sounds like a great, bright future, and we thank you for sharing it with us. My guest today has been Nick Weber. He's the acting director of the Office of Scientific Computing Services for the Center for Information Technology at NIH. I'm Tom Temin. You're watching Federal News Network. Let's go back to the studio now for more on the Cloud Exchange.